I'm reading from EVERNIGHT by Ross Mackenzie. I'm reading the 4th chapter, The King's Witch. In the centre of the great sprawling city of Kingshaven, Mrs. Hester, the Silver King's Witch, entered her private tower in the palace and began to climb to the uppermost room. It was a long way up. By the time she reached the summit of the staircase, her every breath was a gasping rattle. She stopped to compose herself at the heavy door, stooped and hidden under a white shawl. She was glad that her lungs would soon be young again. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said upon entering the chamber, taking a heavy old key and locking the door. "I'm afraid the life of the King's Witch is a hectic one." The room was a square of bare stone. There was no carpet on the floor, no paintings or hangings on the walls. In the centre of the room sat a single wooden chair, fitted with straps for the arms and ankles and waist, the sort of chair designed to hold a person who wants very badly to get away. In front of the chair, a tall, thin object stood draped with a silk sheet. Mrs. Hester observed the person who was strapped into the chair. "So lovely," she said, reaching out and running a knotted old finger down the line of the young woman's jaw. The young woman trembled and tried to pull her head away. A cloth rag had been tied around her mouth so she could not speak, but she uttered frightened, muffled sounds, and her eyes were pleading and wide. "Hush now," Mrs. Hester told her, stroking her hair. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stood beside the chair, and the young woman stared up, tried to see through the layers of material covering Mrs. Hester's head and face. "You want to see why I'm hiding?" Mrs. Hester said. "All right, my pet, but I warn you, it isn't pretty." Mrs. Hester reached up and removed the shawl. When the young woman saw what was hiding beneath, her eyes bugged almost out of her head, and the muffled sound she made became high and desperate. Mrs. Hester's face was a horror, a mask of age and time and decay. It seemed that her features were made of wax, which had melted and begun to run and drip. Her eyes, hidden deep in their ancient sockets, were covered in a membranous white film. Her nose was sunken and shriveled and came to a hideous gristly point. Her mouth was a narrow, dark pocket devoid of moisture. There were nightmarish folds of paper-thin skin hanging from her neck, and silver whiskers sprouting from her sagged cheeks. Most of her bald pate was showing, covering only here and there the scattering of straggly white hair. Mrs. Hester shuffled to the tall object in front of the chair and removed the silk sheet to reveal a full-length mirror, set in a wooden frame carved in the shapes of many birds, crows and sparrows and owls, blackbirds and starlings and eagles. The mirror was double-sided, so that the young woman in the chair could see her reflection, and Mrs. Hester could see herself in the opposite side. "My, I do look a state, don't I?" She shook her head, making the hanging skin on her neck swing back and forth. "But that's what happens, you see, when you're as old as I am. When you've been around for as long as I have." She touched her waxy features with twisted fingers. "And the spell is unpredictable. I can never quite tell when it's going to fade. It happened very quickly this time, which is why you're here, my pet, to sort it." She glanced around the edge of the mirror at the young woman in the chair. "I told you, my pet, that it won't hurt. You are doing your country a great service. You should be very proud." Mrs. Hester reached into her white robes and brought out first her wand and then a tiny spell bottle filled with a few drops of dark, inky liquid. She walked round so that she was standing behind the chair, and she said, "Just one more thing, pet, then we can begin." She reached down and plucked an auburn hair from the young woman's head. Then she took the stopper from the bottle and, with shaking hands, fed the hair into the bottle. As she replaced the stopper, the spell began to spark and fizz and turned the shimmering streaked silver of a pearl. "There we go." Mrs. Hester took her place on the other side of the mirror again and loaded the spell into her wand's chamber. She reached out and touched the tip of her wand to the mirror. The spell flared bright. On the young woman's side of the mirror, the wooden birds carved into the frame all turned their heads towards her. The young woman stared wide-eyed around at them, half expecting the birds to break loose. But that is not what happened. Instead, the young woman's gaze was drawn to her own reflection. At first, she thought that her terrified mind was playing tricks. But then she looked closer, and she could see, with creeping horror, that it was real. Her reflection was changing. It began with a series of deepening lines around her eyes and mouth, and then her hair began to thin and change colour, fade to dirty grey. Although her mouth was tight shut, she could feel her teeth rotting away, her gums receding and drying out. Her shoulders became stooped, her hands painful and twisted, her fingers misshapen. The colour in her eyes faded, and her skin became a loose covering of rubbery folds. In less than a minute, an entire lifetime had passed for the young woman's reflection. When she looked down at her hands and saw that it was real, that it was not some trick, and that she really was an old woman now, a dry, muffled sob escaped her. But she was too weak to struggle, too tired and racked with the pain of old age to do anything but sit slumped in her chair and stare at her new reflection. On Mrs. Hester's side of the mirror, the opposite was happening. Where her reflection had been riddled with the decay of extreme old age, it was now becoming young. The hands of the clock were turned back as her skin flattened and smoothed. Her eyes became large and deep brown. Her hair became sleek and silver blonde. Mrs. Hester raised her hand, watching her fingers straighten and the age spots on her flesh fade until her complexion was silky smooth. When it was done, Mrs. Hester was a much younger woman once more, and quite beautiful. She turned this way and that, examining her reflection, a smile playing on her full lips. Only when the sobbing, mewing sound from the other side of the mirror became too much of an annoyance to ignore did she walk around to the chair. Only a minute ago, a beautiful young woman had been sitting there. Now the unfortunate creature was huddled and ancient, barely able to hold up her own head. Mrs. Hester observed her, stared at her baggy skin and empty mouth, at her milky eyes and mangled joints, and she almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But Mrs. Hester was young again, and there were more important things to consider. She stroked the old woman's hair. Hush now, my pet. I told you it wouldn't hurt, didn't I? You've done a great thing today, and that thought should comfort you in your final hours. The old woman tried to make a sound, but Mrs. Hester was already out of the door.